When it comes to portable music players, Sony is the granddaddy of them all. Their innovative post-World War II cassette players were reliable and beautiful. Sure, Sony had plenty of rivals, but it held its own in a competitive field. Today, Sony has a range of digital audio players. Some of these have no place in polite society. I mean, take a look at the E394. Other Sony players are stupidly expensive and cater to the filthy rich. The WM1Z and the DMP-Z1 cost $3,200 and $8,500 respectively. But in between these wild extremes lives Sony's bread and butter players, and you can't get more bread and butter than the A series from Sony. The NW-A30, 40, 50, and 105 are all basically the same DAP with slight improvements here and there. The A105, for example, is like the A55 but with Android. Today, we take a look at the NW-A55, which is basically the A50 but with slightly different internal construction. You know what? Sony really needs to figure out its nomenclature. I bought the A55 1 year ago. Is the NW-A55 worth your time and money, or is it simply a limited DAP? Sony is not transparent about the components in their DAPs. The A55 is based on the A50, which is based on the A40, which is based on the A30, and yada yada yada. The funny thing is that the dimensions of all these players are nearly identical, and you can interswap cases among them. The A55 supposedly has an aluminum milled frame with solder that contains gold. The use of gold solder and gold in the circuit board allegedly helps mitigate signal loss or some such stuff. The player has a large LCD screen that's fairly sharp and responsive. The player has buttons on the right side, and all of these buttons are logically placed and have strong tactile response. On the left side, there's a flap covering the micro SD card slot. The bottom of the player houses the 3.5mm headphone jack and the proprietary Sony connector. There's nothing on the top, and the back is fairly plain. The player fits in the palm of your hand, but does not feel like a toy. Instead, there's a bit of heft to it. The entire housing is metal and seems robust. Sony relies heavily on a combination of software and hardware. They're like Apple in that sense. The A55 has Sony's DSEE and vinyl processors. DSEE stands for Digital Sound Enhancement Engine. Basically, it's software that upscales lower resolution audio and processes it to make highly compressed audio sound less compressed, at least in theory. The vinyl processor is yet another software enhancement. Think of it as EQ on steroids. The vinyl feature adds some bass boost and, according to Sony's marketing, gives, quote, the warmth and character of vinyl back to your digital tracks, end quote. The A55 has Sony's proprietary user interface. It is not a dumbed-down version of Android, but something Sony created in-house. Power on the player, and you're greeted with the main screen. Every function of the player is at the beck and call of one of the digital buttons and menus. And this, I think, can cause a sense of disorientation to those who are not accustomed to Sony's way of thinking. Some of the options are buried inside sub-menus, others are immediately accessible, and some menus really should be up front but need to be navigated to by several steps. Nevertheless, the A55 has the ability to create EQ or use one of the presets. You can control the DSEE and vinyl processes through sub-menus. The A55 has Bluetooth, including LDAC support. It has NFC if you're into that sort of thing. You can stream Bluetooth from your phone. Thankfully, Sony allows you to use DSEE and vinyl options even when you're streaming audio from another source, like your phone. Sony has a few more tricks up its software sleeves. For example, when you delve into the settings, you gain access to not just the EQ options, but also DSEE, phase linearizer, VPT, dynamic normalizer, vinyl processor, Clear Audio Plus, and select one of two supported IEMs, which reveals additional options to activate noise cancellation, ambient sound mode, and clear phase on those specific supported IEMs. We already briefly spoke of the vinyl processor and DSEE, but a few of the other options should be reviewed as well. VPT is short for Virtual Phones Technology, a piece of software manipulation created by Sony. VPT is digital surround sound. Activate this feature and you can select different room feels, such as studio, club, concert hall, and the Matrix. All of these have a different effect, and a noticeable one at that. To be clear, this is fake surround sound. It is digital. It is manipulation of the music to make it appear like you are hearing the music from speakers in a large room. Does this work? Yes. Is it fantastic? No. There's other fake surround sound stuff you can use, and Sony's just happens to be one of many options. Fake surround sound depends significantly on the music you're listening to and the headphones you are using. So while I can imagine some people will be very happy with this feature, I think just as many might be unimpressed or simply downright unhappy. Then there's the DC phase linearizer. Sony says this makes low-frequency response more like an analog amplifier. You cannot fiddle with this setting. Either it is on or off. I can barely hear the difference with this. DC phase active seems to meld sub-bass with the mid-bass and also emphasizes sub-bass slightly. And strangely enough, this setting reminds me a little bit of a tube amp. Actually, I am certain I am not faithfully describing what this setting actually does. I simply do not know. I can hear a difference, and that difference is minute, and I cannot figure it out. DC phase linearizer has multiple settings to choose from, but only in the higher priced Sony DAPs like the ZX507 and WM1Z. However, on the A55, the DC phase is either on or off, and so you'll either hear a difference or you won't, and if you do hear a difference, you'll either like it or not. Dynamic normalizer is a convenience mode. With this active, the A55 will try to volume match songs. This is helpful when some recordings are louder than others. 1 minute you may have a quiet track with your volume at step 80, and the next track might be very loud and your eardrums will get destroyed. The normalizer is supposed to mitigate such unfortunate occurrences. Clear Audio Plus is the magic setting. You know that fully auto mode on your digital camera? That's Clear Audio. With this feature active, the A55 will process the music and automatically apply DSP. Clear Audio is supposed to sample each track individually. In other words, Clear Audio is not one hard-coded filter that applies exactly the same to every single track. Instead, according to Sony's description, Clear Audio will apply DSP as needed to achieve the best sound. And if you ask me what the best sound means, I have no clue. Basically, it's whatever Sony thinks is the best, and since Sony isn't one to share details, we shall never really know. However, Clear Audio does sound different among tracks. Sometimes the difference is noticeable, sometimes it is slight. But jumping from track to track from different artists and genres, there seems to be a difference in sound processing. The A55 is a Bluetooth receiver and transmitter. In other words, you can use Bluetooth to connect your Bluetooth headphones to the A55 or use Bluetooth to connect to a smartphone. However, you cannot do both at the same time. And to demonstrate hardware synergy, the A55 also has digital noise cancellation. This feature evidently reduces ambient noise, but only works with Sony's NW-A55 and 750 IEMs, which, as far as I know, have been discontinued. The A55 can also function as a USB DAC with PCs, Macs, and Android devices. As we shall talk about later, the A55 does not connect to iOS devices in Dac mode, and that is entirely Apple's fault. As for amplification, Sony uses their patented S-Master amplification circuitry. S-Master! Supposedly, this proprietary technology reduces noise and distortion. Sony says the A55 has 35 milliwatt output at 16 ohms. The volume adjustment has 120 steps for fine tuning. That 35 milliwatt number might make you want to fall out of your seat laughing, but wait until the power output section of this video. Overall, the A55 is built really well. The device feels and looks like a premium product. It is small enough to pocket and large enough to use without frustration. The user interface is fast, and once you get the hang of it, fairly logical. The screen and software response is not any slower than what you'll find on other, sometimes more expensive digital audio players. Indeed, on the hibi R5 and FiiO M15, third-party music apps can take a few moments to launch and demonstrate some lag. Even hibi's own application on the R5 can be a little sluggish at times. But on the A55, Sony's in-house software just works, and without hassle. That, I suppose, is the benefit of building everything from the ground up. As for features, the A55 has everything an audiophile would need. You've got Bluetooth, USB Dac Mode, EQ options, upscaling ability, and overall simplicity in design and use. Clearly, those who want to use Android apps are going to hate this device. You do not get any streaming support, that is, you cannot load Tidal or Spotify onto the A55. You cannot install another music player application. In fact, the only alterations you can make on the A55 is updating the firmware. Sony does not publish information about what DACs they use in their players, so unlike Hibi, Astro & Kern, Shanling, FiiO, QLS, and every other digital audio player manufacturer, Sony does not care to hype the latest DAC releases. This is a breath of fresh air. Instead of arguing over AKM or Sabre or Burr Brown, Sony simply expects you to listen to the music, and either you will like the Sony sound signature or you will not. Right off the bat, let's be clear, the A55 is not neutral. It does not pretend to be, and Sony never claims in their marketing that the A55 is a reference class player. Indeed, Sony merely talks about the construction and software features in this device. The overall sound signature of the A55 is a bit on the warm side, with a slight emphasis in mid-bass, a marginal amount of sub-bass and mid-bass melding, and forward vocals. Treble is mostly detailed but also slightly rolled off, providing a smoother, gentler sound. There are so many different permutations possible through the A55 that the sound signature impression is subject to caveats. For example, if you turn on Sony's surround sound feature, you will get a vastly different experience than if you have it turned off. So, to get the bare bones idea of what the A55 sounds like, I decided to turn off all DSP. No clear audio, no VPT, no upscaling, no EQ, just the player in its simplest settings. I listened to my FLAC files and music over Amazon Music HD with the A55 in Dac mode. I wondered which headphones would suit the A55, and I settled on one that everyone can afford. I used the hifi T2. To get an idea of the T2's performance, I suggest you watch my video comparing the T2 against the Campfire Audio Andromeda. In short, the T2 has a sub-bass roll-off, a slightly recessed mid-bass, though it's probably close to neutral, clear, slightly forward vocals, slightly emphasized treble, and above-average soundstage. The T2 has a clear presentation. In other words, the T2 does not sound analog. Rather, I can imagine some people hearing the T2 and saying that it is clinical. What better pairing than the A55 and the T2? If the A55 adds coloration, then the T2 should have an altered presentation from its stock sound when listening on neutral sources. The bass on the A55 is melded. That is, the sub-bass and mid-bass meld together and create a thick sound. The bass does not sound bloated or boomy. Decay of bass seems to be natural. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the track has a sub-bass rumble from the beginning of the song. The T2 has a sub-bass roll-off that underemphasizes the rumble in this track. However, on the A55, the rumble was easily audible. Sub-bass and mid-bass melded but did not distort or sound muddy. Mid-bass impact is slightly elevated. In songs like Zenith from the band Onuka, easily demonstrate the A55's slight bass coloration. The drums in that track sound full and resonate on the T2. When multiple drums are used all at once, the T2 and A55 pairing allowed the different tonalities to come through, though there was some melding among all those instruments. The mids are slightly forward and retain natural timbre. Every instrument I listened to, guitars, pianos, drums, vocals, sounded full and smooth. Some people may find the T2 harsh in the vocals, particularly with female sibilants. When paired to the A55, there was no sense of fatigue or harshness from the T2. One of my test tracks for sibilance is Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This? This track has natural grain and sibilance mixed into the recording. On a neutral source, the T2 does have a slight emphasis in the sibilance and grain. However, when paired to the A55, the T2 presented sibilance that was slightly rolled off. The energy was still present, but it was not piercing, harsh, or peaky. Some of the grain in the vocals was also smoothened. I tested sibilance again with Haim's Want You Back. The primary vocalist in this track has sibilance which is obvious in the first 10 seconds of the song. The T2 and A55 pairing resulted in a slightly rolled-off sibilance response and presented a smooth voice. Guitars and gruff male vocals have smooth yet still detailed presentation. Guy Clark's songs are perfect for this. Guy uses multiple acoustic guitars in his songs, and he had a very gravelly voice. When the T2 is paired with a neutral source, Guy's voice sounds a bit clinical. That is, guitar transients is a bit fast and the vocals seem to have a slight emphasis in grain and sibilance. However, with the A55, the decay is a little slower. The guitars meld with each other and Guy's voice sounds a little bit smoother. Treble response is gentle on the A55. The T2 can be a bit hot for some people, at least when paired to neutral sources. However, when used with the A55, the treble response was restrained and slightly rolled off. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the T2 and A55 pairing resulted in smooth horns and brass. These instruments did not quite pierce through the other instruments but retained the brunt of their energy. Their characteristic nasally signatures were unchanged. All instruments tended to meld with each other, but nothing sounded muddy or distorted. I listened to several orchestral tracks to get an idea of how the A55 treats cellos, violins, clarinets, and flutes. In all instances, each instrument sounded full and had natural tonality and decay. However, these instruments never became harsh or peaky. Indeed, I always thought that the A55 and T2 pairing rolled off some of the higher-pitched energy. I listened to these tracks at very high volumes, beyond safe listening levels, and simply could not get the music to sound harsh or peaky. The T2 has clarity and at least average detail retrieval. I would not say that the T2 is an analytical IEM, but I can understand why some might believe it to be. The T2's wider soundstage, instrument separation, and sub-bass roll-off might give the impression of a cold or analytical sound signature. The A55 does not alter this perception, I think. The T2's instrument separation is somewhat diminished on the A55. There's more melding among instruments than with the T2 paired to a neutral source. Decay of instruments seems to be marginally slower on the A55. However, the T2's detail retrieval is still quite impressive even with the A55 connected. Yes, melding occurs, and yes, there's a slightly longer decay, but the T2 retains its ability to separate instruments and provide micro details. In other words, the A55 does not make the T2 sound muddy or veiled or undetailed. Instead, there's simply a slight difference, one which may not matter to those who want a warmer presentation from what the T2 provides in stock neutral configuration. I used the song New Light by Kazuki to test detail retrieval. This track has layers of details including the sound of wind, rustling of grass, children playing, synth, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. On a neutral source pairing, such as with the Monolith Liquid Spark and Shitmodi 3 stack, the T2 presents 6 to 7 footsteps. On the A55, the T2 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The difference is that on the A55, some of the footsteps seem to meld with other sounds, whereas on the neutral stack, those footsteps stood out a bit more. This test was consistent with how the A55 and T2 performed with the music I played during the sound signature analysis. I know a lot of people dislike Sony headphones and think that they are too bassy or not audiophile quality. I am not in that camp. I think audiophile quality is whatever you want it to be. There are, I am sure, some minimum requirements we could all agree to. For example, music should not sound harsh and distorted. Everything after that is merely personal preference. The A55 sound signature is warm. That is, I would say it has a bass emphasis, more so in the mid-bass than sub-bass. The mids seem to be slightly forward and treble has a slight roll-off. Instruments and vocals tend to meld a little. The A55 is not neutral. It is not analytical. It is, however, a natural sounding DAP. I'll give you an example. If you think about the COS Porta Pro or KPH-30i, you may have fond memories of them. Or if you currently own one of these, then you may find them to be very pleasant. But what makes these headphones elicit such positive emotions? Of course, assuming that is your experience. The Porta Pro and KPH-30i are not neutral or analytical. They're not detailed headphones and do not provide wide soundstage. But both headphones have a U-shaped signature, where bass is emphasized, treble has a slight roll-off, vocals sound full and fairly natural and intimate. Is this an audiophile sound? Well, if user reviews are any indication, then it looks like the vast majority of people think that the Porta Pro and KPH-30i are audiophile-grade headphones. Turning to the A55, I would say that this DAP has a similar sound signature to that of the Porta Pro and KPH-30i. But let me be clear, I am not saying that the A55 sounds like those headphones. Instead, I am telling you that the A55 also seems to have a U-shaped signature. There's no doubt that the A55 is a warm-sounding DAP, but it does not present muddy or distorted sound, at least not when paired with something like the T2. Of course, you can modify the sound to your heart's content. Sony's software wizardry gives you a lot of options. Sony's user interface and software does take a bit of time to get used to. This is one of those products whose full manual you should actually read. The interface is pretty fast. Let's forget any aspirations that the A55 should compete with modern smartphones. People keep hoping for that type of performance and companies are not providing it. Even DAPs like the M15 do not have performance of that nature. But the A55 is responsive. Boot time is about 5 to 10 seconds, and on every occasion the player will scan the database. But once that is done, the player is ready to use. And because you cannot install third-party applications, all you get is the music player that is baked into the A55. And that player is robust. We briefly discussed the DSP options in a previous section, but I want to emphasize how much customization Sony offers. Most of the time, we're just happy to get a 10-band EQ in a music player app. But with the A55, you get additional DSP functionality, and it all seems to make a noticeable difference. Whether you will like those alterations is a personal matter. When you are playing a track, you can swipe up from the bottom of the screen, and you will have several pages of DSP options. These are the same options that are available through the settings menu. Music playback control is fast, unless you have DSP active. With digital signal processing, the A55 has a 2-second delay before playing a track. This is likely because the A55 has to scan and analyze the track for DSP adjustment. You can install the Sony desktop application on your computer and let that app scan all the music in your drive to analyze for DSP rendering. This would theoretically speed up the A55's DSP performance. But I have never been able to get the Sony desktop application to work consistently. It takes forever to scan my music library for DSP application, and I simply lose patience. Frankly, the 2-second delay on the A55 is perfectly agreeable, and far less of a hassle than using the Sony desktop software. I can think of improvements to the user interface. I would also prefer a quick action button on the track view for DSP. That is, I would prefer to have all DSP options with their own icons on the screen rather than swipe up and flip through pages. Some of you might have additional suggestions, but this is the limit of my minor gripes. One thing I want to point out is that the A55 has never, not once, crashed in the year that I have used it. I cannot say the same for the FiiO M3 Pro, Shanling Q1, hibi R3 Pro, and certainly not for the hibi, FiiO, and Shanling music player apps that you can install on Android-based DAPs. And the A55 is noticeably faster and more stable than the FiiO M3 Pro. It is as fast as the Q1 and the R3, both devices which are recent releases. The A55 has 35 milliwatts into 16 ohms. I will give you a second to stop laughing. Ready? The A55 easily drives the 300 ohm HD6XX. Look who's laughing now. Look, now that I have your attention, let's get into the nitty-gritty. The A55 does not have a gain setting. Unlike in most other DAPs, you cannot select between low, medium, or high gain. It is what it is on the A55. The A55 does not have balanced output, does not have any capability to swap out amp cards, and is an all-in-one package, take it or leave it. The 35 milliwatts is a head-scratchingly low number. I know this, which is why I primarily use the A55 with IEMs. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and T2 Plus, Moondrop Starfield, Campfire Audio Andromeda, Light Harmonic Stella, and Mera, Focus Audio Vocal, and any other IEM you can get your hands on will work just fine with the A55. I cannot imagine any IEM that would not get sufficient or overwhelming power from the A55. But the real surprise was the headphone performance, especially with high impedance headphones. Like I said, the 6XX gets plenty of power from the A55. The A55 has a 120-step volume adjustment. At step 16, the 6XX is barely audible on most tracks. At step 65, the 6XX is at a very comfortable volume where vocals and instruments are all easily audible. At step 90, the 6XX is probably at the limit of safe listening volume. At step 110, the 6XX is well beyond safe listening levels. The 6XX does benefit from more power, though nothing like what you might hear from some other people. Let me give you an example. The hifi Zen Dac has 230 milliwatts into 32 ohms and 36 milliwatts at 300 ohms from single-ended. The hifi Zen Can has 1.6 watts at 32 ohms and 196 milliwatts at 300 ohms from single-ended. A/B tests between the Zen Dac and Zen Can on the 6XX reveal that, yes, the 6XX has a very slight difference in performance when you apply greater amplification. The difference between 36 milliwatts and 196 milliwatts is 160 milliwatts. In other words, in single-ended, the Zen Can is about 5 times more powerful at 300 ohms than the Zen Dac. But you're not getting 5 times better performance from the 6XX when paired to the Zen Can. That's the point I am trying to make. So those who think there is no way that the A55 could possibly drive something like the 6XX, it's been proven over and over again by reviews from countless users that the Zen Dac's 36 milliwatts does in fact drive the 6XX just fine. Would substantially greater power from the A55 alter the performance of the 6XX? Yes, slightly. I suspect if the A55 has considerably more power, then the 6XX might have a slightly tighter bass response and slightly clearer mid-range. But do not let this comment indicate that the 6XX sounds muddy or undetailed on the A55. That is not the case at all. I tested the A55 on the Olo S4X, Austrian Audio Hi X55, HD660S, and Sifka Phoenix. All of these headphones have different power requirements and they all got plenty loud on the A55. All of these seem to get sufficient power for their drivers to perform at peak, or at least close to that mark. I heard no immediate difference between these headphones on the A55 and on my RME-80i, at least not when we are talking about driver performance and ignoring sound signature of the RME. I will say, however, that 300 ohms is probably the limit of the A55. Maybe you can push the A55 a little bit further, but I do not imagine you'd be happy with the experience. For example, the Modhouse Argon and Beyerdynamic T1 2nd Gen never performed at peak on the A55. Both headphones need a lot more power, and in the case of the Argon, at least 1 watt into 50 ohms. As for planar magnetic headphones, it is a truism that planars need more power. Some say planar need more current. If you go to Audeze's website and look at the specs for the LCD2 or review Avantone's specs for their planar, you will notice that both companies recommend a minimum of 250 milliwatts or thereabouts. So large planar drivers may be less than agreeable on the A55. While we're on the subject of power, we should also talk about the battery life. The A55 has some of the best battery life of any DAP I have ever used. From full charge, I can listen to my CD quality FLAC files for easily the entire workday, or 8 hours. Using typical IEMs and using the A55 every day, I have to recharge the A55 once every 3 days or so. Your mileage will vary depending on your headphones, volume, music, DSP application, and whether you use Bluetooth. By the way, the A55 exhibits no noise whatsoever, whether tethered to a headphone or streaming over Bluetooth. Once again, this demonstrates how stupid THX AAA hype is. The A55 has dead simple DAC functionality. On the main screen, you can click on the DAC icon and the player will ask if you want to use the USB connection for Dac Mode. You will need to use Sony's proprietary cable to connect to your devices, and yes, that cable is included in the packaging. And the A55 will connect to Windows, Mac, and Android devices. Unfortunately, Apple will not allow you to connect the A55 in Dac Mode. Every time I tried, I got the pop-up message that the A55 requires too much power, and you can blame Apple for this. When you activate the DAC function, the A55 will scan for a source. If it does not find a connection, it will give you a notice that there's something wrong. As soon as you plug the A55 into your computer or mobile device, the A55 will automatically scan for a signal and display a very helpful menu. On this DAC menu, you can see the player's volume output and you can adjust it from the screen or the side buttons. The screen also displays a signal level indicator, so you can see how the left and right channels are performing. Finally, there is a back button for you to get out of the Dac mode. I have to point out that most of the time when DAPs go into Dac mode, they have a splash screen that does absolutely nothing. The FIO M15, for example, simply tells you that it is now in Dac mode. The same is true for Kane, Shanling, Hibi, and Astle & Kern players. Now this may be a small matter to some, but to me it makes a difference. The A55's DAC screen doesn't offer anything special, but it does offer more info than what you get with other, more expensive players. The A55 has Bluetooth capability. You can either connect the player to your source, computer or mobile device, and stream music, or you can connect to a Bluetooth headphone. To activate receiver mode, click on the Bluetooth icon on the top. If you're adding a new device, click on the next screen to add a device. Pair as you normally would. The A55 has a Bluetooth screen once your devices are paired. On that screen, you will see meaningful pieces of information. First, you will see that the device the A55 is paired to. Second, you will see the codec being used. If you click on the settings icon in the Bluetooth splash screen, you will be taken to a menu screen that has your Bluetooth options. Inside submenus, you will find the option to select stable or sound quality codec settings. While in Bluetooth receiver mode, you can control your source playback with the A55's side buttons. You can apply the A55's DSP options within the Bluetooth receiver mode as well. To connect to a Bluetooth headphone, you will need to be out of the Bluetooth receiver mode. Once in the standard player mode, click into the settings menu, scroll down to Bluetooth options, and select to add a device. Now pair to your Bluetooth headphones as you normally would. Overall, the Bluetooth functionality is perfectly agreeable. The A55 pairs without issues with all devices that I tested. The DAP market is full of options, and too many if I am being perfectly honest. Some companies inundate you with a new DAP every year and declare this newest player is the best ever. Astle & Kern are notorious for dumping yet another overpriced, good-looking, but still limited in functionality product every single year. Then you have FIO, Shanling, and Hibi who have decent options from around $100 to $600, but you still get the same yearly update from them, with the notable differences in DACs or power output. I think most people just want a reliable DAP that sounds good to them. I mean, isn't that what we all are looking for in every audio product? But the more I try DAPs, the more I see companies inching closer and closer to the neutral sound tuning. That is neither good nor bad, but a little disappointing. Whatever happened to variety? This is the reason I hunt for old DAPs. Products like the Ibasso DX50, 80, 90, KN-I5, and Calyx M are incredibly difficult to find sometimes, and they all have unique features. They are unique in style, sound, and functionality. They have character. You may not like what they have to offer, but at least they do things their own way. But when you look at the pile of modern DAPs, there's so much alike among them that you're not really given a meaningful difference. Sure, one may have more power than the other, one may have stock Android whilst another has modified Android, one may look good to you while another is ugly. I get all that. But all of these guys use similar components, and a lot of them have similar tuning. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against modern DAPs. The KN-N3 Pro, FIO M15, Assel and Kern SA700 all have a special place in my heart. But let's be honest, you're overpaying. But the A55 is something rather unique. It is a Sony product from start to finish. They control everything about this player, from the materials to the software. Sony is not worried about shoehorning in the latest AKM or Sabre DAC into their players. They could not care less about the typical reviewer BS hype machine. Sony does its own thing, like it or not, and if you don't like it, then you've got plenty of other options. And it is a breath of fresh air to see a company that is not so focused on cash grab products. This brings us to value. Yes, the A55 is value. Yes, the A55 does things quite well. Yes, the A55 is a contender in the DAP world. When I reviewed the FIO M3 Pro, I said that DAP is a bargain, and I believe that to be the case. If all you need is a simple DAP, then the M3 Pro does it. It's got a good screen, fairly neutral sound, plenty of power for most headphones up to 300 ohms, and is dead simple to use. Its software and performance is sluggish, but that's the flip side of such a cheap product. You could move up the price ladder and get the Shanling Q1 and hibi R3 Pro. You'll get slightly smoother software performance from these devices. The R3 Pro will give you a balanced option. You can keep stepping higher and higher in price, since the sky literally is the limit here. After all, companies really want you to spend all your savings on their more expensive stuff. But if we focus in the $200 region, you've got a few options. The Q1, the R3 Pro, and the M3 Pro jump out to me. And when you compare those three devices to the A55, you see stark differences in method and practice. The A55 does everything those other DAPs do, but more. Sony's DSP options are impressive. Don't take that to mean that I approve or disapprove of what they do. Simply take it as I say it. I think it is impressive that Sony includes DSP that makes audible differences, and which all have different influences on the music. The A55's DAC and Bluetooth modes are no different than in other products, except maybe when it comes to iOS connection, and that is entirely Apple's fault. In build quality, the A55 is no worse than any of the three alternatives that I just mentioned. You may like the screen brightness and resolution from FIO, Shanling, and hibi, but unless you plan to stare at those screens constantly, screen resolution on these types of DAPs makes no real difference. The user interface, software integration, is pretty similar among FIO, Shanling, and hibi options. They all have their own spin, but they all lack the power of the A55 software, for better or worse. The M3 Pro is clearly the sluggish runt of the pack. The Q1 is a little bit better, a little bit faster. The R3 Pro and A55 seem to perform similarly in speed and response. While we're at it, I should mention that the R3 Pro does support MQA decoding and has Tidal and Qbuzz support. This is the way I look at it. I'm not a fan of MQA or Tidal. These are losing propositions, since MQA does not provide better audio quality than Qbuzz or Amazon Music HD. And MQA requires spending more money on compatible hardware. If you're already in the MQA money bit, then I can see why you may disregard any device which doesn't live in that ecosystem. There are two questions you should ask yourself. First, do you care to have streaming support for Spotify, Tidal, Qbuzz, Amazon Music HD, or any similar devices? Second, do you want a sound signature that is a bit warmer, or do you want a neutral presentation? If you say that you want streaming support, then the A55 is definitely out of the running. You can obviously connect via Bluetooth to your mobile phone and then stream audio that way, but that's kind of a backwards way of doing it. If you want a neutral sound, then the A55 may not be to your liking. However, if you don't care to have another mobile device with streaming support, and you do want to try a warmer sound signature, then the A55 is an excellent option. It does nothing wrong. There are no faults in build or usability. The A55 has a lot of DSP options for you to experiment with. The device can easily drive headphones up to 300 ohms. It has a robust battery life. When you come right down to it, the A55 makes a compelling argument. If you want to step away from the usual DAP hype nonsense, then take a look at the A55. On a final note, I want to emphasize that Sony's DAPs rely on the synergy between hardware and software tuning. To that end, I will upload another video comparing the A55's stock firmware to firmware offered by someone named Mr. Walkman. We shall see if the A55 has different performance with alternative firmware. Stay tuned for that comparison.